Hi guys, this week we're going to focus on Owens Valley Paiute, in particular on some of the land use issues that they had traditionally, including something called irrigation practices, which is really kind of unique in the Great Basin. So I wanted to talk about that. And you get this spectacular picture of the Sierra in Owens Valley. And the reason why I wanted to show you that picture at all is to show you how well watered the Owens Valley is. The Owens Valley, as you can see on our little map over here, which is a cruddy map, I'll admit it. Okay, what color should I go? That thing's okay, we'll go blue. Okay, so you've got your basic red area here showing you a big area, which isn't true. That's not to scale, guys. But Owens Valley Paiute is just right up against the Eastern Sierra in Eastern California in a very narrow, small territory. In fact, it's kind of smallish along the scale of what the Washoe Territory was. And it's got some interesting features that we're going to talk about today. Okay, anyway, it's a cool place and it's beautiful. If you ever get that way over to 395 and you get to go north-south on the Sierra, do it. It's just spectacular, and it's really kind of some neat ethnographic stuff and native peoples over in that area, including a casino in Bishop, California. Okie dokie, so another spectacular picture of the Sierra in Owens Valley with a dammed up lake here, but you can see what a trough it is and how narrow the valley is. It's pretty, it really is beautiful, you guys. If you ever get a chance to go over that way, do it. So Owens Valley is a deep structural trough in geologic terms. It's in east central California, so meaning on the east side, but central kind of on the length of California. The valley is over 75 miles long and averages about 6 to 10 miles in width. Its elevation is about 4,000 feet, and it runs generally southeast to the Mojave Desert. So it's in a transition zone as well that kind of goes between sort of cold desert to that hotter desert. It's in that kind of area. Within about 20 miles, every ecozone in the Great Basin is available. So you've got high Sierran resources, and then over into the White Mountains and the Inyo Mountains to the east. The Owens Valley Paiute relied on abundant water from snow-fed Sierra streams, and that's an important component of the lifeway here. A diversity of plants and animals for subsistence. They lived in settlements along the waterways, and the Owens Valley Paiute created a unique system of irrigation channels that enhanced the growth of native food. So it wasn't agriculture in that sense. It was using native foods, but enhancing their environment so that they would grow better, so they get a better, a better take when they were out gathering those resources. So for more than about 3,000 years, they hunted game, gathered pinyon nuts and various seeds, made baskets and pottery as well, and traded with other native groups beyond the mountains. Definitely Owens Valley Paiute people were very much involved with trade routes over the Sierra into the California zone. Absolutely. Wild seed crops and root crops were major sources of food. Again, they're wild. These are not grown agricultural products. Paramount among these products was the pine nut, pinyon pine nuts. They traded salt for acorn. Acorn was a much more dependable crop with that California connection. Remember, pinyon seeds are something that come up every couple years in abundance, not every year, where acorns was much more consistent compared to that. And again, a really good source of food, a nice kind of fat, good kind of fat. So here you have a lovely picture of Owens Valley, and then a couple maps just to show you what we're looking at here, and where we're at. Bishop, California over this way. Woo! And then there's just narrow valley. Bam! Now, Owens Valley is also, oh, that's a bad line, sorry. Owens Valley is also very famous for having its water diverted by Los Angeles, which dried up Owens Lake and dried up the Owens River and severely impacted the Owens Valley Paiute people themselves. As water was diverted in the Sierra, it was dammed up in the Sierra, it was diverted through the LA aqueduct, and all to feed the growing metropolis of Los Angeles and beyond. And so that's another issue with water in this part of the country. Another beautiful picture. Can you tell I love Owens Valley? I would have actually done my PhD work here except my advisor at the time didn't think it was a great idea. But dang, I worked with some really cool people down there, some Paiute people, and it's just a really wonderful area. Anyway, that's here nor there. The Owens Valley Paiute occupied a very small territory compared to other areas, and according to Julian Stewart, natural resources in the area supported a larger and denser population. So it's a very rich area, so you have more people, and in living in a smaller space, so that's that larger, denser population. Villages were larger and closely spaced on the Owens River and those Sierran streams coming out. All essential foods were located within a close distance, so mobility was reduced for these folks. They didn't have to move around this landscape as much to take advantage of the resources there. So instead of traveling most of the year, the Owens Valley Paiute could harvest main foods by walking a day or two from their villages. Villages were not permanent, but they were permanently localized, meaning that the village location was in the approximate location year after year. Not exactly. So you didn't come back and say, here's our spot. Here's our GPS coordinate. That's where we build our houses. It was like, I'm in the area. I'm on Big Pine Creek, and we'll go up that way. So flexible, but, generally speaking, coming back to those same places. And again, they were named. All villages were named. Villages were inhabited consistently over time, and that way they were also stable. So not only were they located in the same place, but they were inhabited by relatively same groups of people. Cooperation between neighboring villages was done for irrigation purposes and for hunting. Ownership of territory, and habitual cooperation led to a cohesion that surpassed other areas. So here you have a band level organization. So to say that again, is that you have this ownership of territory in this small area, this habitual cooperation between people that leads to a cohesion of these folks and a broader identity. And so you have a different level, a slightly more complex level of social and political organization. So districts are an interesting feature of land use and the organization of space and people in Owens Valley Paiute. Districts were comprised of one or two or more villages on streams. They were named. You have a cluster of cooperating villages with a headman. And again, they were, cooperating for irrigation, for hunting, for ceremonies. And you had ownership of strictly defined territories such as linear streams and irrigation zones. If you think about irrigation, it's a lot of work. And you're not just going to go, well, Joe Bob can come in and use it. That's cool. You have ownership of these things. So villages were loosely organized. They were named for topographical features. Given that people came and went, the spot was permanent, but not the people. Okay. Within the village, the family was still independent. So you didn't, you weren't like, okay, whatever our village is doing, that's what we're going to do. You have, again, that hunter-gatherer, fisher-folk independence, which is such a key feature of lifeways in the Great Basin. Villages were occupied part of the year, not all year. During summer, the families went off to gather seeds. During the fall, they went to gather pine nuts up higher in the mountains. Sometimes families camped at pine nut caches during the winter if the harvest was good. Otherwise, they went down into the valleys and returned to their winter village locations. So each spring, families would return to valley villages to conduct irrigation activities. So in the spring, they come back to their villages to irrigate these root plants that were in this area. And they would come again in early fall for social activities. A few to several villages were included in districts, and these districts were land-owning territories. Stewart mapped 5 such units in northern Owens Valley. 2 were more widely dispersed units in the southern part of the territory where water was rarer. So they get a little bit tighter as you go north. And that, again, that reflects that transition from a cooler area to the hotter zones to the south as we move south. So as you get to the north and you have a lot more water there, you have districts that are smaller, okay? Get down, they're larger, which goes hand in hand with the kind of resources that are distributed across that landscape, right? So if you have kind of more kind conditions, a little more water, a little bit cooler. You're going to have a different density of resources than you do when you start getting to that hot zone. Because remember, we're moving down toward the Mojave, and a lot of you have traveled to areas that are southern in the hot deserts, and you can see how the distribution of plants changes completely as we get further south. Now imagine that you're a hunter-gatherer-fisher, and that's a lot of more movement you have to do to gather those resources because they're just distributed further apart, and you also have different kinds of resources available. So streams and villages were much more common in that northern part of the territory. Probably at least 30 permanent villages were present, clustered into these fewer land-owning districts. So 30 permanent villages, according to Stewart. Perhaps 2,000 people in the territory, maybe more. It's a lot of people, 2,000 people. But 30 permanent villages within a few districts is kind of amazing. That's pretty dense. It really is. And if you could drive down there, it's 6 miles wide. It doesn't make sense until you're actually down there. If you're from that picture we saw before, you can see how narrow that is. When you're driving through that area, I mean, it's just like you're just looking from one side of the valley to the other, and it's just right there. And again, you're in the Whites and the Inyos and then the Sierra, and those are mountain ranges that along Owens Valley really come up really steep. There's no foothills really. It's just kabam, up you go. And it really makes for this amazing trough, but really a very narrow valley. So 75 miles down and up and a couple miles across. That's an amazing number of village locations within that area, really. And that speaks again to the density of resources that were present there and the ability to increase, root crops that were there, the wild crops. Crops is the wrong word. Root plants that were there through irrigation to enhance those plant productivity. So that's kind of a cool factoid in Owens Valley lifeways. Districts were not defended territories. Not defended. You didn't have warriors sitting there at the border going, oh, not over here. You get out of my irrigation ditch. No, they were just recognized by everybody there. Interactions between villages within a district included marriage, community irrigation, cooperative hunting, again, antelope and rabbit drives in particular. A chief or a headman was part of the district, and that related to, conducting irrigation activities, rabbit drives, antelope drives. And think about rabbit drives like you learned from the Washoe. Those are kind of big events, and they're important events for those blankets and whatnot. Not to mention all those little, bunny meat, I guess. Bunny jerky. Do they have such a thing? But a chief, a headman was also involved with planning when a fall festival would happen for, say, pine nuts, when dances would happen, when mourning ceremonies were conducted. Could veto or approve the killing of a shaman who was accused of witchcraft. Woohoo! Being a shaman, it's a dodgy job. The headman would call people together to celebrate the pine nut harvest. So they weren't a coercive kind of person. They were a leader that was elected, not elected per se, but put in that position because they were a knowledgeable person, a person who's known to be calm and make good decisions. They weren't elected, they didn't have any coercive force, and they didn't really have, very many powers. They were just leaders of certain kinds of things. Otherwise, they weren't sitting in their perfect little, bigger house with bling on it. They were just like everybody else. So that's an important part of understanding that kind of leadership role. They didn't wear a crown. They didn't have a headdress on. They didn't wear something special. You wouldn't walk into a district and go, oh, there's a headman. Look, he's wearing all that bling. He's wearing that really expensive suit. That's not what happens or happened. Okay, like I've mentioned, Owens Valley Paiute are well known for irrigation practices. Irrigation practice is something we call land management in the vernacular of traditional land use systems and in anthropology. Land use practice and environmental manipulation. So you've got management and environmental manipulation, very purposeful activities to increase productivity of wild plant foods. Okay, it's kind of a big deal, and it was very intensive in Owens Valley. And so you have these two major plant products that were involved, wild hyacinth and then yellow nutgrass, both of them very important things. But this is, really think of this as manipulating the environment to increase productivity. Think about how this relates to the resource area. You have a rich resource area, but it's in a small area, and you have a higher population. You need to feed people, but also if you have more food, your population increases, and it kind of takes on this cycle, which is something we see that leads eventually, not here, not in this context, but worldwide. That's this kind of cycle that kicks in ultimately, agricultural systems, major horticultural systems. But this is a system that is not quite to horticulture. It's still really a hunting and gathering activity. It is not a purposeful food production thing. But you can see where it's a continuum between collecting a wild food source and then managing it like horticulturalists do. And that's the nature of those kinds of lifeways too. It is a continuum. It's never black and white. We go, aha, this is what happened. We're looking at, this continuum and when genetic manipulation might come in, and when humans are so involved that plants can't survive without humans, which we see in full-scale agricultural systems where the plants are like, wait, we need the people. I cannot be corn without my people. And that's not the case here. So this is really just a very, very brilliant way of taking advantage of a local resource and making it that much more productive. Okay, so according to archaeological evidence, these root crops, wild hyacinth, yellow nutgrass being key here, surpassed pine nuts in their importance for this area. The use of these dies out when the Owens Valley Paiute were forcibly removed to Fort Tejon in 1863. No accident there. Of course, you have to. These plants are where they are. You don't take them with you, and because you're not growing them, you're not going to just, well, hey, we're going to Fort Tejon. We're just going to keep doing this. It's localized, so of course it's going to die out. The Owens Valley Paiute were targeting two primary plants in their irrigation efforts. That's this wild hyacinth and the yellow nutgrass, two very important ones. Both produce a tuber/bulb that was very nutritious and very storable. Storable on a short-term level. You're not going to have 10 years of canned bulbs, maybe a season or two, depending on how people processed it. The interesting thing is that these things were not plant names. This term Tubusi here on the lower right, I'm butchering that completely. This one here is a food name. It's not a plant name, which may reflect the importance of this product, this plant food as a food source. And it could be too that this Nahavita, boy, I know I totally didn't say that right, might be a food name as well rather than a plant name. That's something the linguists need to work out. But the difference between a food name and a plant name is really just sort of where it fits in the overall cultural construction of the society. To have it be a food means it is actually more a bigger importance than a plant name. Plant names are important as well, but that you actually elevated it to a food group is in and of itself important. The roots were dug up in the fall, but before this was allowed, the check dams that were set up were destroyed. And that you had to get the land that had been irrigated needed to be a bit dry before you started digging up the roots. So the check dams that were built in these little irrigation ditches and along the streams needed to be destroyed so the area could dry out a bit. In terms of the districts, you had communal efforts in a community within a district where people would come together to do the irrigation activities and the collection of these things. The processing of these foods, they could be eaten raw or pit roasted for storage. And archaeologically, pit roasting should be visible archaeologically, so that could be something if they were going to do that kind of research down there where they really could find out about the history of this. It's certainly something that we see up in the Camas areas up in Oregon and Washington where the archaeological evidence of pit roasting is huge, and it gives them a nice chronology of when these things happened. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, cool stuff, huh? Okay, so this is a map that's out of Julian Stewart's seminal work in Owens Valley. And it's just a cool map I wanted to show you because it really does highlight kind of how this works. So here you've got the Sierra Nevada. Bam, let me do a bad line down there. And then all these little lines. See that? Bam, bam, bam. This is when we start getting into the creeks, and then you have the irrigation ditches occurring off that. And then also in terms of the overall pattern of irrigation in Owens Valley is that you have actual terminology for an irrigator, for the activity of to irrigate, and also the irrigator's pole, that you have linguistic designates for that, which is also another thing speaking to the importance of this in the overall culture, that this is just part of life here. And this just gives you, the map just gives you a nice little overview of, there's the White Mountains here. So those are very white, and the Inyos. And then Owens Lake down there, and all these creeks coming up off the Sierra, and that's where those irrigation ditches come off of these main creeks. So you've got the creeks being used, and then you have irrigation ditches that might be coming off those as well. And those get mapped in an interesting way, which I'm going to tell you about. But anyway, I just thought it'd be fun too to show you a different the map that Julian Stewart created in his volume. It's kind of cool. It's kind of cool. And his work, actually, Julian Stewart was somebody who was very important in the Great Basin. And a lot of his maps are like this. And they're very useful. Archaeologists use them all the time trying to figure stuff out. And so do the ethnographers. And so do Native Americans as well. Okay, clearly this is not a person of Native American descent. This person is of Asian descent, somewhere else in the world, but I wanted to give you a little picture of an irrigation ditch and what it looks like. And these are just small little channels that are dug out, hand dug, and they're off of streams. And so you have a system of check dams, you know, either wood or rocks or something to block and open up and let water in and out wherever you're sending that water to. And again, you're looking at really high flowing streams off the Sierra that are used for this. And so there's lots of different channels going in. So again, not, you know, culturally correct, but I can't find a picture of anything going on in the Owens Valley. Although I have to say, I'm having this memory. I worked in Big Pine, California years ago. And part of the colony of Big Pine Paiute people was up on the eastern Sierra flanks. And they had a series of ditches that were delivered to houses that had been built by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that did not have running water at them, or toilets, or, you know, sinks with tap water. So those guys had created this whole system of irrigation ditches coming off of Big Pine Creek that delivered water to the houses, and people had rigged up a lot of different ways to get running water. Now, mind you, this was in the early 1990s that I was doing work down there with other people, working with the Big Pine Paiute on a project, and it was shocking to see Native American housing in the modern era that lacked these things that we take for granted. Water, okay? Open ditches with hose systems delivering water into the houses. Since then, they've built houses down below that we're going to have all the modern conveniences. But anyway, that's just a little aside there, but shocking. But also to see people then solving an issue with old technology, which is kind of cool, but tragic at the same time. So this is my very cool image created in PowerPoint for your viewing pleasure. Because I just wanted to kind of come up with a schematic to show you kind of what it was like. And really, okay, so this green thing, and I guess this was like an earthquake over here. But anyway, this is the Sierra, and then we have a crooked creek coming down. The blue is the creek. And then what you have here, creek, and then you have this purple thing is a check dam. And then you have the ditches, bam, delivering water over here, and irrigation channels again coming off this way. And this red area is where you have those root plants present and that delivery of water. So it really is a major undertaking. It really is. So, you've got this creeks emanating from the Sierra Nevada. They're dammed near the mountains. And then the OVP, the Owens Valley Paiute, built temporary check dams. And if you don't know what a check dam is, it's something that can be drawn across a creek. It could be logs, rocks, dirt, plant, grass, leaves, whatever you need to block the water. It doesn't have to be, some concrete thing. It can be made, and then it's going to be, it's going to be put together and also taken apart. So that's part of that thing too. So you don't want it to be, this horrible thing. So you've got these check dams that were built across the creek, and then the diverted water went down these hand-dug irrigation channels. And these ditches diverted the water to these swampy grounds already, and then these root plants were, the productivity increased because of that diversion of water. They could swamp drier areas and increase those root plants in those areas, so they could increase the area where these root plants were. They naturally like to be in wetter areas, so then you just create a wetter area so you can kind of like enhance that thing. So you can see where these guys are really on the verge of doing something toward food production, but they're not quite there. Getting close. Who knows what would have happened if it had been, uninterrupted and we could just gaze from space on this. An irrigation headman was elected and had a special pole to control the water. And the ditches themselves were dug with digging sticks. Okay, so this is human labor doing all this. And when the water in the mountains increased in early summer, it was used to inundate those low-lying meadows near the river. So this is an early summer kind of thing before it gets too terribly hot. And then you've got people, flooding already waterlogged grounds. Because again, you have that spring runoff too. So you're going to have overflow on creek banks and stuff. So it's going to be kind of gushy down there off the Sierra. And you saw in those pictures early on how that snow is. I mean, that's just, it really does come down. And the alluvial buildup off those Sierras is rather impressive in the valley. And again, we're in a narrow valley. So, there's a lot of stuff going on here. So, Bishop Creek near Bishop, California was dammed near the mountains every year, and the water was diverted down to those marshy fields. And again, you had that temporary check dam, in that case was made with rocks. At the lower end of the ditch, the water spread out, and the irrigator just manipulated the distribution of water through the use of sod and rocks and logs and whatever else they had. Families held plots, matrilineal, through the mother's line, and that land was assigned to those families. In the fall, before any root digging was allowed, again, the dams were destroyed so the water could resume its natural course, and those areas could dry out a bit before people got in there. It's a lot easier digging when it's a little moist but not soggy. Soggy is not fun to work in. Irrigation districts were maintained, irrigation ditches were maintained by districts. It's a lot of D words, you guys. And extensive teamwork, so a lot of teamwork involved. Watering was done by one man for each district who was that elected official. So that was a male rule. The irrigator used a heavy, long pole. It was used as a bar. It wasn't suitable for digging. Harvesting irrigated root crops was also communally controlled. So you just didn't get to go as an individual, go, you know what, I think I'm going to go get some hyacinth. It was a communal effort. And that makes sense because we're looking at environmental manipulation, we're looking at land management, and as a manager, you've got to manage the harvest as well. It's not every man for himself, or every woman for herself, or every child for his or herself. You've got to manage that to make it work out. And especially when you have communal input into it, then you have communal output. So that makes it fair for all the people. It also reinforces the system. If it weren't fair, imagine that everyone did the work toward that, and then only 3 people went in and got all the plants. That's not good either. So why would you be bothered to participate in that if that were the case? So, that's kind of where we're at here. There's some evidence that seed crops may have been irrigated as well. Seed plants, sorry, not crops. And also the ditches themselves, this is a cool little side thing, provided fish that could be caught as well, especially when they're diverted and dried up. So there you have this whole new ecosystem created by environmental management, land management, and manipulation. It's kind of cool. I hope you appreciate my little weird drawing here. It was fun to do. Okay, so this is another one of Stewart's maps that he documented when he was doing work down in Owens Valley. And so you can see these areas are where the irrigation is occurring, and he's got it running all the way down into the Owens River, which it actually would, given the structure of that valley. So that's coming off of Bishop Creek, and you can see here's the dam. I should get another color. And then the ditch coming off that creek. To those areas where you have the different ditches that are in that area. So that is Patana Patu. So in Stewart's reckoning of this little case here, the position of the head irrigator at this place was also the district headman. It was an honorary position. The man was elected every spring by election. The district headman / irrigator announced a time to begin irrigation, and it was approved by the people. And at this place, all the men might assist in constructing the dam with boulders, brush, sticks, and mud. Water was then turned into the main irrigation ditch. The head irrigator had the sole responsibility of watering the plot by a system of small ditches and dams of mud, sod, and brush. His irrigating tool was a pole, a pavodo, which was about 8 feet long and 4 inches in diameter. So that's just a nice description of what I've told you about from Stewart, who documented this. And then again, after the ditch, after the water was turned into the dish, the fish could be taken out of the dry creek, the stream bed where the water was taken away. And again, once you stopped irrigating at all, you could collect fish from those other places too. So overflow water was allowed to flow to the Owens River. And that's what you're seeing in this image here, because he's got, let me see here, so he's got the dash, dash, dash coming down all the way to the Owens River. And so and then in this area, bam, oh boy, okay, that's I can't do that with the cursor, it's just dumb. So you've got the core area here where you're targeting those root plants. And then you're getting just extra stuff in this area where it's getting wetter. Now again, think about this in terms of environmental manipulation. These people are observing all of these things that are happening because of this water, so they're very well aware of what's going on here. Okay, so you've got increased production in these areas down below too, just by the outcome of having that water drain down that way. Northern and southern plots were alternated. They did not irrigate these things every year. So that was an important component too. You didn't do that all the time. Okay, this is my redrawing in PowerPoint of a map in Stewart. I wanted to show you some of this. So this was a map produced by one of Julian Stewart's consultants, an Owens Valley Paiute gentleman named Jack Stewart. The intensity of harvesting was not known, according to Stewart and his informants, but it was likely that there was not a total take of the product, that you didn't take everything, because then you affect regrowth. This was an incredibly labor-intensive undertaking. The digging sticks were made out of really hard woods like mountain mahogany, and those were used to dig up the tubers and bulbs of these plants. And the excavation, again, and the maintenance was team effort, and again, communal harvesting and all that stuff. So the unirrigated seed areas, okay, like down below, were wide open. Visiting people could just go in there and get those when those seed-bearing plants were plentiful. So it was only in the irrigation areas, like this one here, that were controlled in that way. Okay, so you have those series of check dams, and people controlled that. That's communal. It's communal input, communal output, meaning the effort going into it and the actual harvesting. Then we come down into the overflow areas, and you see seed production of wild seed crops increasing in this area, and that's just open to anybody. So this is owned and controlled, and this area is not, which is kind of cool too. It kind of reflects that ethos of a hunting and gathering society, which I think is pretty cool. But this gives you a nice little image, I think, better than the original drawing would show you of what these irrigation ditches look like on the ground, according to Mr. Stewart, the Owens Valley Paiute consultant. So here's another map from Stewart just to show you an idea of like how intense this was. So the hashy areas are irrigation areas, and then the little triangles are village locations too. So you can see this clustering along these. You know, here you have Baker Creek coming down. That's an important central kind of place for village locations and activities. And you got Big Pine Creek coming down, Birch Creek, Tinnamaha Creek, Taboose Creek, and then all of these little triangles, village locations. So you can just see how intense Owens Valley was in terms of, you know, this land management and these village locations and the whole thing. And that, again, goes to that small area, that increased population, and that, you know, a little more complex socio-political organization. But it's also just a really cool map, and I wanted to show it to you because I really love Stewart's maps, in case you haven't noticed. So this is a little story of some archaeological / historic investigations on trying to figure out this irrigation thing, and it's kind of neat. Lawton, who was one of the co-authors of this article, Agriculture Among the Paiutes, the Paiute of Owens Valley, and some other people went on undertook this digging around trying to figure this out. And so these guys went on a crusade in the 1970s to figure out what was going on with this irrigation in Owens Valley. Stewart was kind of ambiguous in his understanding of irrigation. You know, he saw that it was a native practice, but he was wondering if it diffused from the Southwest, or did Europeans introduce it? And so people have been looking at this, trying to figure this out. So these guys go on this hunting expedition to look at early accounts of irrigation to see if they can find evidence of it. And so von Schmidt came to Owens Valley to survey for the U.S. government in the mid-1800s, 1856. 1855, 1856 is when he was around. So mid-1800s, right? Really, you know, it's not too. It's fairly early for there. You still have Spanish influence from the South. It's possible, but anyway. Von Schmidt came in to survey for the U.S. government, and he was establishing township and section lines and establishing corner markers and recording this recording these places on plat maps and making notes for the U.S. government. And that's something we see nationwide, where the surveying, the section 7, 8, 18, 17, the township range system across the nation, this mapping of making squares across our landmass, and then recording things. And the plat maps are the original maps that the surveyors were doing. And they make these cool notes, and they also made little observations about stuff. Like they would note maybe a village location for a Native American village or some other feature. So, and it wasn't consistent necessarily. It was kind of up to what the surveyor had seen. And von Schmidt was like, well, let's look at those early plat maps and see if there's any observations of irrigation during this time period. And lo and behold, they find it. It's there. So these guys, so they're not only, they're on the ground observing this too, so they're making their maps, but they're out walking this stuff and checking it out. And it's actually one of the cool things in terms of every once in a while you get to see an old section marker or an old corner marker that's one of the original ones, and it's pretty neat because it really is one of those crazy stories of the settling, the colonization of the Americas. Is just this transformation into squares. And how profound that is. It really is kind of neat. Anyway, that's an aside. So as part of these surveying activities, these early surveyors record things like soil, water, the presence of Native Americans, the activities of those guys. So von Schmidt was the first non-native to observe Owens Valley Paiute irrigation. The surveyors were mapping 1 square mile units, and their notes that go along with that provide some idea of the distribution of irrigation, what they called creeks at the time. They didn't recognize it as irrigation. So the survey indicates irrigation is described from Rock Creek to Independence Creek, which was pretty much the entire length of the Owens Valley. Von Schmidt's data indicate the irrigation ditches averaged about 40 inches wide, but sometimes they were much wider. They were measured with chains, and the distances between were also measured, and these figures showed very systematic positioning. Now, von Schmidt didn't really recognize this at the time. It's when they come back and look at this and they go, oh, those aren't creeks, those are the irrigation ditches. And he would not have expected any Native Americans to be doing this in this area. You know, they were Digger Indians after all. They didn't know how to do this sort of stuff. So all along the valley, from Independence Creek in the south to Rock Creek, the survey recorded 10 irrigation areas, and all were on the west side of the valley above Owens River, and all were located in proximity to a creek emanating from the Sierra. And that way it reflects what Stewart had done, but then he's actually there walking across these ditches and recording them, because it's like, oh, another creek, oh, another creek, oh, another creek. And so when you come back and look at it later, you go, oh, those are the districts. And so they're being able to map the districts through this, which is pretty cool, actually. And it's really a kind of a neat historic story, you know, what kind of data you can look at and how you can pull that, and the different ways we can look at these sources of data and understand things. And it just really goes to show how qualitative and social research can be done, which is kind of cool. Anyway, so you've got all along the west side of the valley, these locations, these 10 irrigation areas that were identified inadvertently by von Schmidt. And the localities range in elevation too, from like 4,000 to 5,000 feet. So they're a little up off the valley floor toward the Sierra, not on the total bottom of it. And you can just see that, you know, you've got a lot of irrigation systems that are involving many square miles of land. And that's one of the main sources of compiling all this information. You look at what Stewart has, you look at the accounts of Owens Valley Paiute people, of what they say, and then you can look at these maps and get a nice picture of what's involved, which is pretty cool. So the thing about irrigation practice in Owens Valley was a lot of people were wondering if it was an indigenous practice, if it had not been adopted from the Spanish, for example, or from Southwest peoples who were growing corn and whatnot down south. And again, Lawton was important in this discussion, and really have come up with the idea that it was indigenous, that it was a very well-defined practice, that the linguistics, those names of the headmen and all of that, linguistic change isn't automatic. To have these terms indicates some kind of longevity to a practice, to have these, you know, to irrigate, irrigators pull, irrigator, and then to have those plant names be food names rather than plant names is another, you know, indication of something larger, something older than what we have. So Lawton et al., when they were doing this research, they were looking into the historical records, trying to figure out if it was indigenous. And what they found with their research was that it was well established by the 1850s, not only technologically, but socially. If you look at the organization behind it, to have an irrigator who's elected, the communal nature of it, that downriver, that you have, open access in those seed areas, that, you know, it's something different. It's not adopting things from these pictures below, from Southwest activities of corn growing or from the Spanish. It is something that seems to have occurred well before that. So they figured it extended at least to 1820, before the Spanish mission was created in that area, and that we're teaching Native peoples in California, because the Spanish were involved with teaching Native people how to do agriculture. So they're asserting a time depth that goes back to Aboriginal times and seeing this as a local feature that was native to that area. And again, the linguistics of this supports that idea. So I think that's a really important part of this whole story. So, you know, it's kind of a neat thing, really, and it makes a lot of sense given the environment that people lived in. People were not unaware of the environmental conditions. They would be very aware that the root plants in those areas were more productive where they were wet. It's not that hard to figure out. And then to go, we just move the water over that way. We can sog it up and get more of those plants. And really, you don't tend those. You just wet them down, get them wetter, they're growing. You don't have to weed it. You don't have to go protect them. If you're growing in food production zones, when you're in horticulture, you have to protect those plants. You have to weed them, you have to weed those plots. It's a lot of work going into horticulture and agriculture. And in many ways, irrigating completely fit into the overall hunter-gatherer fisher lifeway for these folks, which is another part of, this adaptation. All right, I've already answered this question, but we'll go over it anyway. So was the irrigation, was it agriculture? It's not. It's not agriculture. Agriculture and horticulture are purposeful plant manipulation along with all the other kinds of practices that go with it. But from gathering to agriculture is a continuum. It's not a black and white thing. So irrigation practice is something that's maybe on the way. But the thing is about hunter-gatherers, the road to domestication is paved with process. It goes from protection to encouragement to cultivation to actual genetic manipulation as part of that whole story. But the thing that we see with hunter-gatherers, and particularly in the Great Basin, is that there are many places where people could have cultivated plants. They could have been domesticators, and they chose not to be. It is much easier being a hunter-gatherer. And when you're in an area where the environment's kind of, it's tough committing to plant cultivation that way. It makes a lot more sense to have irrigation fit into an overall hunting-gathering pattern than it does to just kind of make it separate and go towards domestication. It just makes a lot more sense that you get to, go on and do something else after you've wet those areas. You get to go do other things and gather those products and do those activities that need to be done. So it wasn't agriculture, but it's something really interesting, and it really is an amazing land management practice. And in that regard, these are people who, exquisitely adapt to the environment that they're in. They were so good at it and knew what it offered and knew what they could do and knew what the limits were. And they did that. We tend to look at these things like, well, gosh, if they'd only done this, they could have been agriculturalists, and that would be so much better. Well, it's not better to be an agriculturalist. That's a huge undertaking. It's a hard life. Your dietary components go down. Your overall health goes down. We see this archaeologically all over the world. There are consequences for agriculture. Populations rise incrementally to the point where, sustaining the population itself becomes its own kind of and you have these guys still balancing this all out, and it makes a lot of sense to do what they did. And so yeah, agriculture is something people could do, but that's not what's going on in Owens Valley. And it's something else, and something cool and worthwhile in and of itself. Not something they forgot to do. Oh, dang it, if we'd only done a little bit more, we could have been full-scale agriculturalists, then we'd be really cool. It's not what's going on here. So, pretty amazing, pretty cool stuff. Anyway, I'll see you later.